Let's talk about a number. Not a big number, not a scary number in the grand scheme of things. Not $1 million, not a down payment on a Manhattan penthouse, not the kind of number that requires a wealth manager and a monogrammed briefcase. We're talking about $20,000, 20 grand, the price of a used car, a modest kitchen renovation, about 4 months of rent in a mid-tier city. In the context of lifetime earnings, in the context of what most people will make over the course of a career, $20,000 is not an enormous sum. And yet, for a staggering number of people, people with jobs, people with decent incomes, people who are not blowing their paychecks on sports cars and bottle service, that first $20,000 in savings feels like trying to fill a bathtub with a teaspoon while someone else has the drain open. The money comes in, the money goes out, the account hovers. Progress feels invisible. 6 months pass and the balance is essentially the same. A year passes, still essentially the same. And somewhere in there, a quiet but corrosive thought starts to form. Maybe this is just how it is for me. Maybe saving is something other people do. That thought is wrong, but it's also not entirely your fault that it formed. This video is about why the first $20,000 is so disproportionately difficult, harder in many ways than going from 20,000 to 100,000, or from 100,000 to 1,000,000. It's about the specific psychological, structural, mathematical, and cultural forces that make early saving so brutal. And it's about what you can actually do to break through them, not generic advice, not cut your lattes. Real mechanistic explanations for why you're struggling, paired with real solutions that address the actual problem rather than the symptom. We're going to cover a lot of ground. We'll talk about why your brain is physiologically wired to resist saving. We'll talk about the mathematical reality of building momentum from zero, and why the math itself is the enemy in the early stages. We'll talk about the structural features of modern financial life that are specifically, almost ingeniously, designed to extract money from people who don't have much of it. We'll talk about income, expenses, the dangerous middle class, lifestyle inflation, the surprising psychology of small wins, and the moment, the specific identifiable moment, when saving stops feeling impossible and starts feeling inevitable. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why you're where you are. And understanding why something is hard is the first and most necessary step toward actually doing it. Let's go. Chapter 1. The math is actually against you. At first. Here is something that nobody tells you clearly enough when you're starting from zero. The math of saving does not reward you at the beginning. At all. In fact, in the early stages of building savings, the math is actively demoralizing, and if you understand why, you'll stop interpreting that demoralization as evidence that you're failing and start interpreting it correctly as evidence that you're in the hardest part of a process that genuinely gets easier. Let's start with compound interest, because compound interest is the concept that gets trotted out in every personal finance conversation as the magical engine of wealth building, and it is genuinely magical, but only after a certain threshold. Before that threshold, it is basically invisible, and treating it as a motivation tool in the early stages of saving is like telling someone who just planted a seed that they should be excited about the shade. Here's the math. You save $500 a month. You put it in a high-yield savings account, earning, let's say, 4.5% annual interest. At the end of month 1, you have $500. Your interest earned $1.88. $1.88. That's what compound interest looks like on a small balance. It's not inspiring. It's barely visible. After 6 months of perfect $500 contributions, balance of approximately $3,038, interest earned over those 6 months, about $38. You saved $3,000 with discipline and consistency, and the universe rewarded you with $38. After a full year, approximately $6,142. Interest earned over the year, about $142. Now let's fast forward. After 5 years of the same $500, monthly contribution at the same 4.5%, approximately $33,600. Interest earned over those 5 years, about $3,600. That's meaningfully more, but notice that the overwhelming majority of your balance is still money you contributed yourself, not money that grew from interest. It's only after a decade, after the balance gets large enough, that compounding starts to feel real. After 10 years, roughly $75,000, with about $15,000 of that being earned interest. That's real money. That's compound interest actually doing something notable. But most people don't have 10 years of patience baked in. Most people are looking at their balance after 6 months and thinking, why am I doing this? Nothing is happening. My sacrifice is producing $38 in interest. My rent went up $150, and I feel exactly as financially fragile as I did before I started. That feeling is not irrational. It's a mathematically accurate read of early-stage saving. The problem isn't your perception. The problem is that the rewards of saving are radically backloaded. They compound over time in ways that are invisible at first and dramatic later, and our brains are not wired for backloaded rewards. We are wired very deeply and very stubbornly for immediate feedback. The threshold problem. There's a second mathematical reality that makes the early stages particularly brutal, and it's what we might call the threshold problem. Below a certain savings threshold, you are financially vulnerable in ways that actively drain your savings. Above that threshold, you're not. Here's what I mean. When your savings balance is zero or near zero, a single unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, a broken appliance, a temporary income disruption, has to go somewhere. And in the absence of savings, it goes on a credit card, or it becomes a missed bill, or it becomes a short-term loan, or it comes out of next month's rent and creates a cascade. Any of these options costs you money, sometimes a lot of money. The credit card charges interest. The missed bill charges a late fee. The short-term loan charges a rate that makes credit card interest look benign. You are paying a poverty premium, a tax on not having money, that directly reduces the amount of money available to save. This is sometimes called the financial fragility trap, and it has a specific mathematical structure. The less you have saved, the more expensive life's inevitable disruptions are, which means the less you're able to save, which means you remain fragile, which means the next disruption is equally expensive. It's a loop, and the loop has a specific exit point. The moment your savings balance is large enough to absorb a typical unexpected expense without resorting to expensive debt. For most people, that number is somewhere around $1,000 to $2,000, a basic starter emergency fund. Until you cross that threshold, you are not really in a savings accumulation phase. You are in a financial fragility management phase, which is a much harder place to be and a much harder context in which to build momentum. Every time you get close to the threshold, life nudges you back below it, and it costs you extra to recover. This is not a character flaw. It's a structural feature of having low savings. Understanding it means you can address it directly. The first goal, before anything else, is not to save $20,000. It's to save $1,000 in a separate account, untouched except for genuine emergencies. Get above the fragility threshold. Stop paying the poverty premium. Then build from there. Why zero feels worse than zero. There's a mathematical phenomenon that compounds the threshold problem, and it involves starting not from zero, but from negative. A significant number of people beginning their savings journey are not starting at zero. They're starting below zero, carrying credit card debt, student loans, car loans, or some combination thereof. Their net worth isn't zero, it's negative. For these people, the question of saving is entangled with the question of debt, and the math of that entanglement is brutal. If you have $5,000 in credit card debt at 22% interest and you save $500 in an account earning 4.5%, you are simultaneously earning $22.50 in interest and paying $91.67 in credit card interest on that debt. Your net financial position is actually deteriorating by about $69 per month, even as you faithfully contribute to savings. This creates a genuinely confusing decision that most personal finance advice glosses over. Should you pay down debt or build savings? We'll get deeper into this in a later chapter, but the short answer is it depends on the interest rate, and for high-interest consumer debt, paying it down first almost always wins mathematically. The psychological argument for maintaining some savings while paying debt, the security it provides, the behavioral benefit of not feeling completely depleted, has merit. But the math is clear that high-interest debt is a negative investment with a guaranteed terrible return. and eliminating it is equivalent to earning that return risk-free. The reason this matters for the $20,000 question is simple. If you're starting below zero, your first $20,000 of financial progress isn't building a $20,000 balance. It's getting from negative territory to zero, and then building from zero. That journey is invisible in the way that matters most psychologically. Your savings account doesn't show you the debt you paid off, it just shows a balance, and that balance is small, and small feels like failure even when it isn't. The savings rate math nobody shows you. Here's one more mathematical reality that makes early saving disproportionately hard, and it involves savings rates and income levels in a way that's counterintuitive. When people talk about saving a percentage of income, 10%, 15%, 20%, they're describing a ratio. But ratios behave very differently at different income levels when you factor in fixed costs. Consider two people. Person A earns $40,000 a year, take home about $32,000 or roughly $2,667 per month. Person B earns $100,000 a year, take home about $72,000 or roughly $6,000 per month. Now let's say fixed costs, rent in a modest market, transportation, utilities, basic food, insurance, phone, run about $2,000 per month. These are not luxuries. These are the minimum costs of functioning as an adult in most American cities. For person B, $2,000 in fixed costs represents 33% of take-home. They have $4,000 per month in discretionary income. Saving $600 per month, 10% of gross, leaves them $3,400 for everything else. That's comfortable. That's livable. The savings rate feels achievable because the fixed costs are a small proportion of income. For person A, $2,000 in fixed costs represents 75% of take-home. They have $667 per month in discretionary income. Saving $267 per month, the equivalent 10% of gross, leaves them $400 per month for everything that isn't a fixed cost. That's food beyond the bare minimum, clothing, healthcare out of pocket, transportation beyond a basic bus pass, any social activity, any entertainment, any irregular expense. $400 for a full month of everything. This is why saving at lower incomes isn't just harder proportionally, it's harder categorically. The math of fixed costs means that lower earners face a genuinely different problem, not just a scaled down version of the same problem. The solutions that work at higher income levels, just save 15%, are often arithmetically impossible at lower ones, not because of poor discipline, but because the numbers don't work. The path forward at lower incomes isn't to save the same percentage as higher earners. It's to address the fixed cost structure, find ways to reduce the largest fixed costs, find ways to increase income, or both, while saving whatever is genuinely possible in the meantime. Progress is slower. It is still progress, and the principles that make progress possible are the same, regardless of income level, even if the timeline is longer. We'll come back to all of this. For now, the takeaway from this chapter is simply this. The math works against you at the beginning. The returns are invisible. The fragility is expensive. The fixed cost burden is proportionally heavier. This is not your fault. It's the structure of the problem, and knowing that it's the structure, not your character, not your discipline, not some inherent incapacity for financial management, is the first thing that changes. Chapter 2. Your brain was not built for this. Here's an uncomfortable truth delivered with as much gentleness as the subject allows. Your brain, the remarkable 3-pound organ that allows you to compose music and solve equations and appreciate irony, is spectacularly poorly designed for the specific task of saving money. Not because you're dumb, not because you lack willpower, but because the cognitive architecture that humans developed over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution is almost perfectly calibrated to undermine modern financial behavior. This is not an excuse. Understanding why your brain resists saving doesn't mean you can just shrug and blame your amygdala, but it does mean you can stop interpreting every failure to save as a moral failing and start interpreting it as a design problem, something to be worked around with systems and structure rather than powered through with raw willpower. The distinction matters enormously. Let's talk about the specific ways your brain is working against you. Present bias. The now beats the later. Every time. The most fundamental cognitive obstacle to saving is what behavioral economists call present bias, the tendency to weight present rewards more heavily than future rewards, even when the future rewards are objectively larger. This isn't a character flaw, it's a deeply embedded feature of human cognition that made excellent sense in the ancestral environment. If you lived in a context where the future was genuinely uncertain, where food not eaten today might not exist tomorrow, where resources not used immediately might be taken by a rival, where tomorrow was genuinely less probable than today, prioritizing the immediate made survival sense, the brain that said, eat the food. Now, there might not be food later outcompeted the brain that said, save some for future me. In environments where future me was far from guaranteed to exist, we no longer live in that environment. The future is considerably more likely to arrive than our ancestral brains believe, but the wiring hasn't updated to match the circumstances. We still experience the present as disproportionately real and the future as disproportionately abstract, which means that the pleasure of spending $20 today feels more real and more valuable than the benefit of having that $20 in savings 5 years from now, even though the rational math says the future benefit is larger. Researchers have quantified this with a concept called the discount rate, the rate at which people subjectively devalue future rewards compared to present ones. Most people discount future rewards at rates far higher than any reasonable investment return could compensate for. Some studies find that people require future rewards to be 2, 3, even 5 times larger than present ones to feel equivalent. That is an extraordinary implicit discount rate, and it means that telling someone to save now for a reward they'll enjoy in 30 years is asking them to choose a future reward that their brain prices at essentially nothing over a present reward their brain prices at full value. The practical implication: willpower-based approaches to saving, I'll just choose not to spend, are fighting against a deeply ingrained cognitive bias with nothing but intention. They work sometimes. They work unreliably. The people who save successfully over long periods are generally not people with superhuman present bias resistance. They're people who've set up systems, automatic transfers, payroll deductions, structural separation of savings from spending, that remove the moment of choice entirely. You can't lose a battle you never have to fight. Loss aversion. Losing feels twice as bad as winning feels good. The second major cognitive obstacle is loss aversion, one of the most replicated findings in behavioral economics. The research pioneered by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky consistently finds that the psychological pain of losing something is roughly twice as intense as the psychological pleasure of gaining something of equivalent value. In practical terms, losing $20 feels about as bad as gaining $40 feels good. The pain of a loss is disproportionate to its magnitude. How does this affect saving? In a few ways. First, savings contributions feel like losses. The money is leaving your checking account, the account you interact with, the account that feels like your money, and moving somewhere else. Even though it's still your money, the act of transferring it triggers mild loss aversion. It feels like subtraction, not addition, which makes it psychologically costly in ways that have nothing to do with logic. Second, and more insidiously, loss aversion makes it psychologically harder to recover from setbacks. When you've been saving faithfully for months and then an unexpected expense wipes out a significant portion of your progress, the pain of that loss is psychologically enormous, disproportionately larger than the satisfaction of the months of progress that preceded it. This is why so many people give up on saving after a major setback. It's not just the financial cost, it's the emotional cost of experiencing a large loss right after working hard to build something. The implication here connects back to the threshold problem from Chapter 1. You need to get to a balance large enough that a single unexpected expense doesn't feel like a devastating loss. When you have $500 saved and you spend $400 on a car repair, you've lost 80% of your progress. That feeling is brutal. When you have $5,000 saved and you spend $400 on a car repair, you've lost 8%. The math of the expense is identical. The psychological experience is completely different. Mental accounting, the bizarre way. We categorize money. Here's one that's less well known but equally important. Mental accounting, the tendency to treat different pools of money as fundamentally different even when they're mathematically equivalent. Mental accounting shows up in saving in a specific way. Money that comes in as a paycheck feels different from money that comes in as a tax refund or a bonus or a gift. Money in a checking account feels different from money in a savings account even at the same bank. Money earmarked for rent feels impossible to use for anything else. Money sitting in a general account feels spendable even if you plan to save it. The practical result is that people will simultaneously carry credit card debt at 20% interest and maintain a savings account earning 3%, convinced these are two separate things that don't interact. They do interact. They interact in exactly the way the math says they do. But the mental accounting system that treats debt and savings as separate compartments is remarkably resistant to logical override. Mental accounting is also why windfalls, tax refunds, bonuses, inheritance so frequently disappear without building lasting wealth. They arrive in a mental category labeled extra or unexpected, which triggers a different spending framework than regular income. Regular income has already been mentally allocated to bills and necessities. The windfall feels free, so it gets spent in ways that regular income wouldn't. The financial result is identical: money in, money out. But the psychology is completely different. The system-based implication: treat windfalls the same way you treat regular income. Have a plan for them before they arrive. The moment a windfall hits your account without a destination, it will find its own destination. And that destination is usually not your savings account. The scarcity mindset. How stress makes you financially worse. There's a body of research synthesized in the excellent book Scarcity by Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir that documents something both intuitive and devastating. Having too little of something, money, time, food, creates a cognitive condition they call tunneling, in which the mind becomes hyper-attentive to the immediate scarcity and loses bandwidth for longer-term planning. In plain terms, being poor makes you worse at financial decision-making. Not because poor people are less intelligent or less disciplined, but because the cognitive load of managing scarcity is so high that it literally reduces the mental bandwidth available for everything else, including planning, patience, and the kind of deliberate decision-making that good financial behavior requires. The research found that low-income individuals performed worse on cognitive function tests administered right before payday, when their financial situation was most strained, than on the same tests administered right after payday, when the immediate pressure was relieved. The difference was equivalent to roughly 13 IQ points and a full night's sleep. The stress of financial scarcity doesn't just feel bad. It measurably impairs the cognitive functions you most need to improve your situation. This creates a vicious cycle. Financial stress impairs decision-making. Impaired decision-making produces worse financial decisions. Worse financial decisions produce more financial stress. Breaking out of this cycle requires either reducing the stress by building the buffer, getting above the fragility threshold, or deliberately creating decision-making contexts that don't rely on in-the-moment cognitive capacity, automation, pre-commitment devices, rules-based systems that work even when you're stressed and tired. Hedonic adaptation, the treadmill. Nobody asked for. The last cognitive obstacle in this chapter is one that affects people at every income level, but particularly those in the middle range where discretionary income exists, but isn't unlimited. Hedonic adaptation, also called the hedonic treadmill, is the well-documented tendency for humans to rapidly adapt to new circumstances, returning to a relatively stable level of happiness regardless of major positive or negative changes. The practical implication for saving: lifestyle improvements feel great when they happen, and then quickly become the new normal. The apartment upgrade that felt luxurious in month 1 feels ordinary by month 6. The nicer car that produced genuine daily pleasure for the first few weeks becomes just the car you drive. The restaurant that felt like a treat when you first had money to eat out becomes the baseline. Hedonic adaptation means that lifestyle expansion tends to be financially permanent, even though the happiness it generates is temporary. Once you adjust to a higher expense level, the psychological reward has evaporated, while the cost remains. And because you've adapted to the higher level, returning to the lower one feels like a loss. Remember loss aversion, which makes reversing lifestyle inflation psychologically painful, even when it's financially necessary. This is why income increases so reliably fail to improve savings rates for most people. When income goes up, expenses tend to rise proportionally or more because each upgrade in lifestyle produces temporary pleasure that rapidly adapts away, creating appetite for the next upgrade. The treadmill keeps pace with income growth, and the gap between income and expenses, the gap that produces savings, stays stubbornly narrow. Breaking the hedonic treadmill requires something counterintuitive, deliberately resisting the upgrade impulse at the moment of income increase. The single most effective savings behavior many financial experts recommend is to automate savings increases every time income increases, before lifestyle adapts to the new income level. If your paycheck goes up $300 a month and you automatically direct $200 of that into savings before you ever see it in your checking account, your lifestyle adapts to the remaining $100 increase, not the full $300. You get some lifestyle benefit and significant savings benefit. If instead you let the full $300 land in your checking account, lifestyle adapts to the full amount within a few months, and the savings opportunity evaporates. Bringing it together. The brain is the problem and the solution. What this chapter hopefully makes clear is that the struggle to save isn't primarily about discipline or math or even income. It's about cognitive architecture, the way the brain is designed to process rewards, losses, categories, scarcity, and adaptation. These are features that are deeply embedded, evolutionarily ancient, and not susceptible to simple willpower override. But here's the important part. Understanding the architecture means you can design around it. Present bias is solved by automation that removes the moment of choice. Loss aversion is solved by building the buffer that prevents devastating setbacks. Mental accounting is solved by deliberate labeling and separate accounts that work with the categorization tendency rather than against it. Scarcity mindset is solved by reducing the financial fragility that creates the cognitive load. Hedonic adaptation is solved by automating savings increases at the moment of income growth before adaptation occurs. None of these solutions requires you to become a different kind of person. They require you to set up systems that work with who you actually are. That is a much more achievable task, and it's where the real leverage in building early savings lives. Chapter 3. The system is extracting from you, and it's very good at it. Let's take a break from talking about your brain and talk about something external for a moment, because as much as cognitive bias contributes to the difficulty of building early savings, it would be genuinely unfair to lay the entire burden at the feet of your psychology. There are structural features of modern financial life that are specifically, deliberately, and in some cases elegantly designed to extract money from people who don't have much of it. These aren't conspiracy theories, they're business models, and understanding them, really understanding how they work and why they're so effective, is a prerequisite for navigating around them. This chapter is about the extraction economy, the collection of financial products, services, pricing structures, and cultural systems that are disproportionately expensive for people with lower savings and that actively work against the accumulation of that first $20,000. Some of these will be familiar. Some will reframe things you've accepted as normal in ways that might make you mildly furious. Both reactions are useful. The poverty premium, paying more for being poor. We touched on this in Chapter 1, but it deserves its own full treatment because it is one of the most significant and least discussed structural obstacles to early saving. The poverty premium, sometimes called the poor tax, refers to the phenomenon by which people with lower incomes and lower savings pay more for essentially the same goods and services than people with higher incomes and established savings. This shows up in so many places it's worth going through them one by one. Banking fees. Standard checking accounts at major banks typically charge monthly maintenance fees, often $10 to $15 per month, that can be waived by maintaining a minimum balance, usually somewhere between $1,500 and $2,500. If you have that balance, the fee disappears. If you don't, if you're living paycheck to paycheck and your account regularly dips below the threshold, you pay the fee. You're paying $12 to $15 a month, every month, specifically because you don't have enough money to avoid the charge. Over a year, that's $120 to $180. Over 5 years, nearly $1,000. Paid by the people who can least afford it, waived for the people who can. Overdraft fees compound this. The standard overdraft fee at major banks has historically been around $35 per occurrence. If you overdraft 3 times in a month, not unusual for someone managing a very tight budget, that's $105 in fees on top of whatever expense triggered the overdraft. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has found that overdraft and NSF fees disproportionately fall on low-income account holders. Some banks have moved to reduce or eliminate these fees in recent years, and there are now genuinely excellent free checking options, online banks, credit unions, neobanks, that charge no monthly fees and no overdraft fees. If you're paying banking fees of any kind, you need to switch accounts. Today, there is no legitimate reason to pay a bank for the privilege of holding your money. Insurance pricing. Auto insurance, renter's insurance, and homeowner's insurance all use credit scores as a pricing factor in most states. The reasoning from the insurer's perspective is actuarial. Credit scores are statistically correlated with claim frequency, but the result is that people with lower credit scores, who are disproportionately lower income, pay more for insurance than people with higher scores, regardless of their actual driving record or claims history. The difference can be substantial. Studies have found that drivers with poor credit pay 50% to 100% more for auto insurance than drivers with excellent credit, all else equal. You're paying a premium for being financially vulnerable, which makes you more financially vulnerable, which makes it harder to improve your credit score, which keeps the premium high. Rent to own and buy here, pay here. The rent to own industry. Companies that let you rent furniture, electronics, and appliances with the option to own them after a set period of payments is a masterclass in extracting wealth from people with limited savings. The effective interest rates on rent-to-own agreements are frequently in the range of 100% to 300% annually. A television that retails for $400 might end up costing $1,200 to $1,600 through a rent-to-own arrangement. These products exist almost exclusively in lower-income markets because people who have $400 simply buy the television. People who don't have $400 pay 3 times as much for it over time. Similarly, buy here, pay here car dealerships that cater to buyers with no credit or poor credit routinely charge interest rates of 20% to 30% on vehicles that are often overpriced to begin with. Payday loans and cash advances. The payday loan industry charges fees that translate to annual percentage rates of 300% to 400% or higher. A $15 fee on a $100 2-week loan doesn't sound catastrophic until you annualize it. That's a 390% APR. The business model depends entirely on customers who don't have savings, because someone with savings doesn't need a payday loan. And the structure of the loans, designed to be rolled over when the borrower can't repay in full, frequently traps borrowers in cycles that extract hundreds or thousands of dollars for what started as a small cash flow gap. This is not a fringe industry. Millions of Americans use payday loans every year, and the majority are people who are fully employed but living close enough to the financial edge that a temporary gap between income and expenses requires external bridge financing, check cashing services, people without bank accounts, and there are millions of unbanked Americans, often rely on check cashing services to convert their paychecks to cash. These services typically charge 1% to 3% of the check amount. On a $2,000 paycheck, that's $20 to $60 per pay period. Multiply by 26 pay periods per year, and you're paying $520 to $1,560 annually for the service of converting your paycheck to usable money. This is a fee paid specifically because the person doesn't have a bank account, which often comes from a history of banking fees and overdrafts, which came from not having enough money, which is the poverty premium cycling back on itself. The insurance trap. Nobody mentions. There's a specific financial product that deserves special attention because it targets people with limited savings especially effectively. Extended warranties and protection plans. Best Buy, for example, makes a substantial portion of its profit not from selling electronics, but from selling Geek Squad protection plans on those electronics. The same is true at every major retailer that offers protection plans at checkout. The economics of extended warranties are straightforward. They are, on average, worth less than they cost. The retailer prices them to be profitable, which means the average buyer pays more than they receive in return. For a wealthy buyer, they're a bad deal, but not a significant one. For a buyer with limited savings, they're a bad deal that serves a psychologically rational but economically irrational function. They reduce anxiety about a large purchase going wrong when you don't have savings to absorb the loss. In other words, extended warranties extract extra money from people who buy them because they're financially fragile, which keeps them financially fragile, which makes them more likely to buy the next extended warranty. The solution is not courage in the face of risk. The solution is building the savings buffer that makes the extended warranty unnecessary, at which point you stop buying them and start keeping that money. Subscription creep and the architecture of forgetting. Here's a subtler extraction mechanism. The modern subscription economy is specifically designed to exploit the way human memory and attention work. Subscriptions are priced to be below the threshold of active attention. $9.99 per month for one service, $14.99 for another, $7.99 for a third. Because below a certain amount, people don't actively track expenses. The individual amounts feel trivial. The aggregate is not. The subscription model also exploits what behavioral economists call the cancellation friction effect. Services are easy to sign up for and deliberately difficult to cancel. They're often canceled through a multi-step process that includes a retention offer, a cooling off period, and an interface designed to make you feel like you're about to lose something valuable. The friction is engineered. It is not accidental. A typical American household carries somewhere between 3 and 12 active subscriptions at any given time, often including several that are rarely or never used. The national average monthly spend on subscriptions has been estimated at anywhere from $200 to over $300 per household per month. That is $2,400 to $3,600 per year on recurring charges, many of which are providing value well below their cost. The audit is simple, but most people avoid it because it's mildly uncomfortable to confront how many things you're paying for. Go through your bank and credit card statements for the last 3 months, identify every recurring charge, and ask for each one whether you'd pay for it today if it weren't already set up. Not, is this nice to have? Would I specifically choose to spend this money right now, knowing what else I could do with it? The answer for a meaningful number of those subscriptions will be no. Canceling them doesn't require sacrifice. It requires 5 minutes and a few clicks. The car, the single biggest financial drain. Most people don't question. If there is one area where the extraction economy intersects with cultural normalization to produce enormous ongoing financial damage for ordinary Americans, it is the automobile. Not because cars are inherently bad, they're often genuinely necessary, but the way most Americans buy, finance, insure, maintain, and replace cars is a machinery for wealth extraction that has become so normalized that questioning it feels eccentric. The average new car payment in the United States is now over $700 per month. The average used car payment is over $500 per month. These are not luxury purchases. These are average numbers across all buyers. Add insurance, average roughly $150 to $200 per month. Fuel varies by location and vehicle, but often $100 to $200 per month. And maintenance, roughly $80 to $100 per month on average. And the total monthly cost of the average American car ownership is somewhere around $1,000 to $1,200 per month. That is $12,000 to $14,000 per year, directed at a depreciating asset before you've saved $1. The cultural normalization of this is extraordinary. We accept car payments the way we accept rent, as a permanent, inevitable feature of adult financial life. Many people carry a car payment for their entire adult lives, paying off one loan and immediately rolling into the next, because the new car is financed before the old one is paid off, and the cycle never ends. The math of what redirecting even a portion of car-related spending towards savings would produce is startling. The point is not that everyone should drive a $3,000 beater and never think about transportation comfort. The point is that transportation is often the largest discretionary cost in a person's budget. It's the one most accepted as fixed when it isn't, and it's worth scrutinizing with the same rigor you'd apply to any other spending of comparable magnitude. The invisible hand of marketing. There's one more structural force worth naming before we move on, and it's the most pervasive, modern marketing. The entire enterprise of advertising across television, social media, streaming, search, outdoor, and every other medium exists to create desire for things you didn't previously want. It is extraordinarily well-funded, extraordinarily sophisticated, and extraordinarily good at its job. The people designing these systems are using the same behavioral economics research that this video has been drawing on: present bias, loss aversion, social proof, scarcity signaling, but in reverse. They're not using it to help you save, they're using it to help you spend, and they have budgets, data sets, and targeting capabilities that dwarf anything available to the average consumer trying to resist them. The most effective modern marketing doesn't feel like marketing. It feels like aspiration, entertainment, community identity. The Instagram feed that makes you want a different kitchen isn't selling you a kitchen directly. It's selling you an identity that happens to include that kitchen, which makes the desire feel internal and authentic rather than manufactured and commercial. The haul video that makes you want to buy 20 clothing items isn't advertising in the traditional sense. It's parasocial entertainment that happens to make purchasing feel exciting and social. There's no complete defense against this, and attempting to be fully impervious to marketing is probably not a realistic or enjoyable goal, but being conscious of it, specifically naming it when you feel an impulse to purchase something you didn't want before you encountered a piece of content, creates a small but meaningful gap between stimulus and response. That gap is where the decision actually lives. The practical move: implement a waiting period for non-essential purchases above a threshold you define, 48 hours, a week, however long it takes for the initial impulse to settle and for you to evaluate the purchase on its actual merits rather than in the glow of manufactured desire. Most impulse purchases examined 2 days later don't survive the scrutiny. The ones that do were probably genuine wants worth spending on. The waiting period costs nothing and saves a meaningful amount of money over time. Chapter 4: The Income Problem and the Conversation. Nobody wants to have here is the part of the personal finance conversation that most personal finance content either glosses over or addresses with infuriating superficiality. Sometimes the reason saving feels impossible is that your income is genuinely too low relative to your cost of living to produce meaningful savings at any reasonable lifestyle. Not because of poor discipline, not because of too many subscriptions, not because of cognitive bias, because the math doesn't work. This is an uncomfortable thing to say in a genre that likes to empower people with the message that their behavior is fully within their control, and behavior is significantly within your control. We've covered a lot of behavioral ground in this video and we'll cover more. But behavior operates within constraints, and for some people at some income levels in some markets, the constraint is binding enough that no amount of behavioral optimization will produce $20,000 in savings on the current trajectory. If that's you, this chapter is for you, not to depress you, to reframe the problem accurately so you can address it directly, rather than spending years feeling guilty about a situation that guilt isn't equipped to solve. The math of insufficient income. Let's do a direct calculation. You live in a mid-sized American city. Your take-home income, after taxes, after any benefits deductions, is $2,800 per month. Let's build a realistic budget. Rent for a one-bedroom apartment in a mid-tier market, $1,100 to $1,400. Let's say $1,200. Transportation. You need a car. Used car payment on a modest vehicle, $300. Insurance, $130. Gas, $100. Basic maintenance reserve, $50. Total transportation, $580. Food, groceries for one person, cooking at home most of the time, $300. Occasional dining out because you are a human being who occasionally needs to eat food made by someone else, $100. Total food, $400. Utilities, electricity, gas, internet, phone, $200. Health insurance out of pocket, assuming employer covers most of it, but copays and prescriptions add up, $75. Basic personal care, clothing, household supplies, $100. Fixed debt payments, student loans, let's say a moderate balance, $250. Total fixed and necessary expenses, $2,805. Your take-home income is $2,800. Your necessary expenses are $2,805. You are $5 short before you've bought a birthday gift, replaced a worn-out pair of shoes, covered a medical bill, or saved a single dollar. There is no behavioral optimization that fixes this math. You could cancel every subscription, never eat out, give up all entertainment, and you'd have perhaps $200 to $300 per month to work with. Still not enough to reach $20,000 on any reasonable timeline, and achieved at a lifestyle that is genuinely punishing to maintain. For this person, the savings problem is fundamentally an income problem, and the solution is primarily an income solution. The behavioral chapter is not irrelevant. Every dollar matters at this income level, but the leverage is overwhelmingly on the income side. Cutting expenses at the margin of an already bare budget produces small gains. Increasing income produces large ones. The income conversation. What actually moves the needle? There are essentially 4 levers for increasing income, and they have very different time horizons, effort requirements, and potential magnitudes. Let's go through all of them honestly, without the motivational poster gloss that makes them sound easier than they are. Lever 1. Negotiating your current salary. This is the highest leverage, lowest effort income lever for most employed people, and it is systematically underused, particularly by women, by people early in their careers, and by people who don't realize it's normal to negotiate. The research on salary negotiation is consistent. Asking works. Not always, not by as much as you'd like. But asking for a raise or negotiating a starting salary produces a positive result more often than not, and the cost of asking is low. Typically mild discomfort and occasionally a no, which leaves you exactly where you were before. The upside of a successful negotiation, even a modest $3,000 to $5,000 annual raise, is $250 to $417 per month before taxes. That is not trivial. At lower income levels, that's the difference between being able to save and not being able to save at all. The foundation of a successful negotiation is market data, knowing what the role you're in pays in your market, using resources like Glassdoor, Levels.fyi for tech roles, LinkedIn Salary, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you're being paid below market, you have a factual basis for a conversation, not just a preference. If you're being paid at or above market, the negotiation is harder but not impossible, especially if you can document specific contributions or achievements. The best time to negotiate is when you have leverage, when you have another offer, when you've just achieved something significant, or during a formal review cycle, but there is no universally wrong time to have the conversation. The worst realistic outcome is not right now. Lever 2. Changing jobs. Job switching is, statistically, the most reliable way to achieve significant salary increases for most people in most fields. The data consistently shows that external hires are paid more than internal promotions for equivalent roles, and that people who change jobs every 2 to 4 years earn significantly more over a career than people who stay at the same employer and rely on annual merit increases. Annual merit increases at most companies average 3% to 5% in normal economic conditions, barely keeping pace with inflation, let alone building real income growth. A job change, by contrast, typically produces salary increases of 10% to 20% or more, with jumps of 30% to 40%, not uncommon in fields with strong demand for skilled workers. This is uncomfortable advice for people who value stability and loyalty, and those values are legitimate. But it's worth being honest about the financial cost of loyalty in a labor market that doesn't generally reward it symmetrically. You can stay at the same company for a decade out of genuine appreciation for the culture and the people. Just know what it costs and make the choice consciously. Lever 3. Developing skills that increase your market value. This is the lever with the longest time horizon and the highest potential upside, but also the most variable outcomes and the most work required. Developing new skills that increase your earning potential can mean formal education, certifications, self-directed learning, apprenticeships, or simply accumulating experience in a direction that the market values more highly. The honest framing. Not all skills investments pay off equally. Graduate degrees in high-demand professional fields, engineering, computer science, nursing, accounting, law, medicine, tend to produce reliable income increases that justify the cost. Graduate degrees in lower-demand fields often don't. Coding boot camps produce wildly variable outcomes depending on the boot camp, the student's prior background, and the job market conditions when they graduate. Online certifications range from highly valued by employers to essentially decorative, depending entirely on the specific certification and the field. The best skill investments are targeted, not general. Research what specific skills are valued in roles that pay meaningfully more than your current role in your market. and then invest specifically in those skills rather than in general improvement. Talk to people in those roles. Look at job postings for positions you'd want in 2 or 3 years and identify the skills they require. Then build a specific plan to acquire them with a realistic timeline and cost estimate. Lever 4, additional income streams. The fourth lever, side income, freelancing, gig work, part-time work, is the one that personal finance media covers most enthusiastically and most superficially, usually with the implication that everyone can easily generate meaningful supplemental income if they just try hard enough. The reality is more nuanced. Additional income streams are real and valuable for people who have the time, the skills, and the specific opportunity to develop them, but they are not a universal solution, and the costs, time, energy, additional tax complexity, the opportunity cost of not resting, are real and often underweighted. The most effective supplemental income streams are those that leverage skills you already have, rather than requiring you to build new ones from scratch. If you're an accountant, tax preparation side work during filing season is a natural fit. If you're a writer, freelance content work can be genuinely lucrative. If you have a truck and some physical capacity, helping people move is straightforward side income. If you're skilled at a specific software program, teaching it online or freelancing with it is accessible. The less effective supplemental income pursuits are generic gig economy work with very low effective hourly rates once expenses are factored in. Driving for a rideshare service, for example, sounds like easy extra money until you account for vehicle depreciation, additional insurance costs, fuel, and the self-employment tax, at which point the effective hourly rate for many drivers is surprisingly low, sometimes below minimum wage once all costs are counted. If you're going to pursue additional income, be specific about what you're doing, calculate the actual hourly rate honestly, including all costs and taxes, and make sure it's actually moving the needle rather than producing the feeling of productivity without the financial substance. The skills premium is real, but so is the time it takes. Here's the honest version of the income chapter that most personal finance content is too cheerful to give you. Increasing your income takes time, sometimes a lot of it. The person at $35,000 who wants to be at $60,000 is not going to get there in 6 months through hustle and positive thinking. They're going to get there through a combination of negotiation, strategic job moves, deliberate skill development, and time, probably 2 to 5 years if they're focused and a bit lucky. That timeline is not a failure, it's reality. And in the meantime, while the income is growing, the behavioral work matters. Every dollar saved at lower income is a dollar that earns interest, reduces financial fragility, and builds the momentum that makes the next stage easier. The behavioral optimization and the income growth aren't competing priorities, they're parallel tracks that reinforce each other. But if you've been grinding on the behavioral side, cutting expenses, auditing subscriptions, resisting purchases, and your savings still aren't moving because there's genuinely not enough income to produce meaningful savings after necessary expenses, please hear this clearly. That is not a willpower failure. That is a math problem. And math problems require math solutions. The income lever is the one you need to pull. A note on the earnings ceiling and what breaks it. There's a harder version of the income problem that deserves a brief mention. Structural earning ceilings that aren't easily moved by individual effort alone. Geographic constraints, industry constraints, discrimination, health limitations, caregiving obligations, credential barriers, these are real, and they affect real people's ability to increase their income through the levers described above. These constraints don't make increasing income impossible, they make it harder and slower in ways that are not evenly distributed. Pretending they don't exist or implying that sufficiently motivated people can always overcome them is both false and unkind. The honest acknowledgement is this: individual financial behavior and individual income decisions operate within structural contexts that genuinely vary in how constraining they are. Someone facing multiple structural barriers to income growth will have a harder path to $20,000 than someone with the same discipline and behavior but fewer barriers. That's true. It's worth naming. What remains true regardless of structural constraints is that clarity about the actual problem, whether it's behavioral, income-based, structural, or some combination, is the necessary first step toward addressing it. Misdiagnosing a structural income problem as a behavioral discipline problem sends you in entirely the wrong direction, applying effort where it won't produce results while the actual lever goes untouched. Know what your actual problem is. Address the actual problem. That's the work, however unsexy it sounds. Putting chapters 3 and 4 together, by now we've established 3 major layers of the first $20,000 problem. The math is against you at the beginning. Your brain is working against you all the time. The system is extracting from you with considerable sophistication. And for some people, the income simply isn't sufficient on the current trajectory to produce meaningful savings without addressing the earning side. None of these are reasons to give up. They're reasons to be strategic rather than just effortful. Effort without strategy produces exhaustion. Strategy channels effort toward the places where it actually produces results. In the chapters ahead, we're going to get into the specific, practical mechanics of actually building momentum, the sequencing of financial moves, the account structures, the psychological techniques, and the mindset shifts that turn the first 20,000 from a distant abstraction into a concrete, achievable, actually happening reality. The hard truth section of this video is mostly behind us. The actionable section is ahead. Chapter 5. The sequence matters more than the amount. There is a specific mistake that derails more people in the early stages of saving than almost any other, and it's not spending too much or earning too little, though both of those matter. It's doing the right things in the wrong order. Personal finance has a sequence, and when you follow it, each step creates the conditions that make the next step easier. When you ignore it and try to do everything simultaneously or skip ahead to the exciting parts, you end up scattered, frustrated, and making less progress than your effort deserves. This chapter is about the sequence, not the only possible sequence. Personal finance isn't surgery, and there's room for individual variation, but the order of operations that most people in most situations will find produces the most traction with the least wasted effort. Think of it as a hierarchy of financial moves where each level stabilizes the one above it and makes the entire structure more resilient. Level 0. Stop the bleeding. Before you can save anything, you need to address the things that are actively destroying your financial position. This is the level that most personal finance content skips because it's unglamorous and uncomfortable, but it's the foundation everything else sits on. Stopping the bleeding means, specifically, eliminating predatory financial products that are costing you dramatically more than they're worth. Payday loans, rent-to-own arrangements, sky-high interest cash advances. If you have any of these in your life, eliminating them is the first financial move, not because it builds savings directly, but because these products are destroying your financial position faster than any savings behavior can repair it. Paying 300% APR on a payday loan while trying to save money is like trying to fill a swimming pool with a garden hose while someone else has a fire hose pointed at the drain. The hose has to be dealt with first. Stopping the bleeding also means getting your banking right. If you're paying monthly maintenance fees, switch to a free account today. If you're regularly triggering overdraft fees, either set up a linked savings account as overdraft protection, switch to a bank that doesn't charge overdraft fees, or set up low balance alerts so you can proactively manage your account before it goes negative. These are small changes with immediate, permanent financial impact. Level 1. The Starter Emergency Fund. Once the immediate bleeding is stopped, the first savings goal, the only savings goal, is $1,000 in a separate dedicated emergency fund. Not invested, not in a retirement account, not combined with your regular checking, a separate savings account, clearly labeled that you do not touch for anything other than genuine, life-disrupting emergencies. Why $1,000? Because it's achievable enough to build momentum and large enough to absorb the majority of common financial disruptions, a car repair, a medical copay, a home appliance replacement, without requiring debt. It's the threshold we discussed in Chapter 1, getting above the financial fragility line where unexpected expenses stop becoming expensive debt events and start becoming manageable withdrawals. The $1,000 starter fund is not the full emergency fund you'll eventually want. That comes later. It's the bridge. It's what keeps you from going backward every time life does what life does. How fast can you build it? That depends entirely on your income and expense situation. For some people, 1 or 2 months of modest belt tightening gets them there. For others, at very low income levels, it takes longer. What matters is that it's the singular, exclusive focus until it's done. Not retirement contributions, not paying extra on debt, not investing. $1,000 in a separate savings account. Everything else waits. Dave Ramsey's Baby Steps framework, whatever you may think of its other prescriptions, gets this part right. The starter emergency fund comes first, before debt payoff, because having no buffer while paying down debt means that every unexpected expense goes back on the debt you just paid, creating a depressing and demoralizing loop. The buffer breaks the loop. Level 2, the employer match. If your employer offers a 401k match, meaning they will contribute to your retirement account based on your own contributions up to some percentage, capturing that match is the second priority before aggressive debt payoff and before building your full emergency fund. Here's why. The employer match is a 50% to 100% instant return on your money, depending on the match structure. If your employer matches 100% of your contributions, up to 4% of your salary, contributing 4% produces an immediate doubling of that money before it even gets invested. No debt payoff, no savings account, no investment produces a guaranteed 100% return. The employer match is the single best return available in personal finance, and not capturing it is leaving free money on the table in a way that no other financial priority justifies. The specific amount to contribute, exactly enough to capture the full match, and not $1 more at this stage. We're not optimizing retirement savings yet. We're capturing the free money while keeping maximum cash available for the next priority. Once you've completed the sequence and are saving beyond $20,000, you can revisit maximizing retirement contributions. For now, the match and nothing more. Level 3, high-interest debt elimination. With the starter fund in place and the employer match captured, the third priority is eliminating high-interest consumer debt. Specifically, anything above approximately 7% to 8% interest rate, which is roughly the long-run expected return of a diversified stock portfolio. The math rationale is clean. Paying down a debt at 22% interest is equivalent to earning a guaranteed 22% return on that money, completely risk-free. No investment on earth offers a guaranteed 22% return. Therefore, eliminating that debt is the superior financial move compared to any investment option available. This applies most powerfully to credit card debt, which tends to carry the highest interest rates. It applies to personal loans with high rates. It applies to any debt where the interest rate is meaningfully above what your savings could reliably earn. It does not necessarily apply to lower interest debt like federal student loans at 4% to 5%, or a car loan at 4%, or eventually a mortgage at 6% to 7%. These are closer calls where the mathematical case for accelerated payoff versus investing is genuinely debatable, and the right answer depends on your specific rates, your risk tolerance, and your psychological relationship with debt. For high-interest debt, there are two widely recommended payoff strategies, and the choice between them depends on your psychology. The avalanche method targets the highest interest debt first, regardless of balance size, mathematically optimal. It minimizes total interest paid over the payoff period. The challenge is that the highest interest debt is often not the smallest balance, so visible progress can be slow, which tests motivation. The snowball method targets the smallest balance first, regardless of interest rate. Mathematically suboptimal, you'll likely pay more total interest than with the avalanche. The advantage is that small balances get eliminated quickly, producing the psychological reward of a fully paid account, which research suggests significantly improves follow-through for many people. The right method is the one you'll actually complete. If you have strong financial discipline and can sustain motivation through a long payoff period without visible early wins, do the avalanche. If you know yourself well enough to recognize that you need early wins to stay engaged, do the snowball. Paying off debt somewhat suboptimally is vastly better than not paying it off at all. Level 4, the full emergency fund. Once high-interest debt is eliminated, the fourth priority is building your emergency fund from $1,000 to its full target, typically 3 to 6 months of actual living expenses kept in a high-yield savings account. 3 months of expenses is appropriate if your income is stable, you have relatively few dependents, and you have some additional resources you could lean on in an extreme emergency. 6 months is more appropriate if your income is variable, you're self-employed, you have dependents relying on your income, or your industry is prone to disruption. Some people with particularly volatile income or high financial obligations go to 9 or 12 months. This is on the conservative end, but entirely reasonable for the right circumstances. Calculate the target based on your actual monthly expenses, not your income, not a round number you picked from a personal finance article, but your actual monthly spending. If your necessary monthly expenses are $2,800, a 3-month emergency fund is $8,400, not $10,000, because that's a rounder number. Be specific. Specific targets are more motivating than vague ones. Where to keep it? A high-yield savings account at an online bank is generally the right answer. These accounts currently offer meaningfully higher interest rates than traditional savings accounts at brick-and-mortar banks. They're FDIC insured, and they're accessible within 1 to 3 business days if you need the money. The slight delay in accessibility compared to a checking account is actually a feature, not a bug. It creates just enough friction to prevent casual rating of the fund for non-emergencies. What counts as an emergency? Genuine, unexpected, necessary expenses. A job loss. A major car repair that's preventing you from getting to work. A medical situation, not a sale on something you want. Not a vacation that didn't make it into your budget. Not a gift you didn't plan for. The emergency fund has one job, and diluting it with non-emergencies means it won't be there when you actually need it. Level 5. Saving for the 20,000. Here's where the chapter title comes back into focus. By the time you've completed levels 0 through 4, you may actually be most of the way to $20,000, or well on your way. The starter fund is $1,000. The full emergency fund might be $8,000 to $15,000 depending on your expenses. The debt elimination freed up monthly cash flow. The employer match is building retirement wealth on autopilot. The 5th level is directed savings towards specific goals, the $20,000 target if you're not there yet, but also other medium-term goals, a down payment, a car replacement fund, a major life expense, an opportunity fund. At this stage, the question shifts from how do I survive financially to how do I build toward what I want? That's a fundamentally different and more enjoyable problem to have. The sequence has done its job. You have a buffer, you have no expensive debt, you have retirement contributions happening, and you have monthly cash flow that isn't being consumed by interest payments. Now you can direct that cash flow toward growth. The mechanics at this level are straightforward. Automate the savings contribution, make it happen on payday before the money touches your spending account, and let it accumulate. The behavioral challenges don't disappear at this stage, they just become less acute because you have the buffer that reduces financial stress, the momentum that reinforces the behavior, and the track record of your own capability that makes the goal feel real rather than theoretical. The power of the sequence, why order matters. Here's the underlying logic of the sequence, stated directly. Each level creates the stability that makes the next level sustainable. Without the starter fund, unexpected expenses destroy debt payoff progress. Without debt elimination, interest payments consume the cash flow needed to build savings. Without the full emergency fund, any significant disruption sends you back to debt. Each piece is load-bearing for the one above it. Trying to do all of these simultaneously, saving for retirement, paying down debt, building an emergency fund, and saving for specific goals, all at the same time, spreads limited resources across too many fronts and produces slow progress on all of them, which feels demoralizing and produces worse behavioral outcomes than focused sequential progress on one front at a time. The sequence isn't a law, there are legitimate variations. Some people maintain a small emergency fund while doing debt payoff rather than waiting until debt is fully gone. Some people prioritize certain debt types differently based on their specific rates. Some people in specific situations, older people with very little retirement savings, for example, might appropriately prioritize retirement contributions more aggressively even before full debt payoff. These are judgment calls that depend on your specific numbers, but the basic architecture, buffer first, then debt, then savings, in that order, is sound for most people in most situations, and following it produces better outcomes than treating all financial priorities as simultaneous and equally urgent. Chapter 6. Building Momentum. The Psychology of Getting Started and Staying Started. Here's a pattern that repeats so consistently across personal finance behavior that it's almost a law. People who reach the first $5,000 in savings have a dramatically higher completion rate for reaching $20,000 than people who haven't. People who reach $10,000 have an even higher rate. The early progress is not just financially meaningful, it's psychologically transformative, and understanding why is the key to engineering it deliberately. This chapter is about momentum, what it is, why it matters so much in the early stages, how to build it when you have none, and how to maintain it when life tries to knock it over. Why the first dollar is harder than the thousandth. Behavioral economics has a concept called goal gradient, the tendency for motivation and effort to increase as you get closer to a goal. Laboratory research with animals and humans consistently finds that the pace of goal-directed behavior accelerates as the finish line approaches. Rats run faster toward food as they get closer to it. People fill loyalty punch cards faster when they're closer to the free coffee. The implication for savings is that once you have meaningful progress toward a goal, the goal itself becomes more motivating. Seeing a $4,800 balance when your goal is $5,000 creates a pull toward the finish line that seeing a $200 balance when the goal is $20,000 simply doesn't. The early stages of saving, when the goal is far away and the balance is tiny, are motivationally the worst possible position to be in, which is why they're also the stage most prone to abandonment. The solution is to engineer early wins deliberately, not by lowering your ultimate goal, but by creating intermediate milestones that are close enough to produce the goal gradient effect. Your goal isn't $20,000. Your goal is $1,000. When you hit 1,000, your goal is 2,000. When you hit 2,000, 5,000. When you hit 5,000, 10,000. Each milestone is close enough to feel achievable, and reaching it produces the psychological reward that makes the next milestone feel attainable. This sounds simple to the point of condescension, and yet most people don't do it. They set a large goal, get a little bit of the way there, notice that the large goal is still very far away, and conclude that they're failing, even if their progress is objectively reasonable. Reframing progress as a sequence of near milestones rather than a single distant goal is a behavioral intervention with real impact. The automation imperative. We've mentioned automation in previous chapters, but it deserves its own focused treatment here because it's the single most powerful savings behavior available, bar none. More powerful than budgeting, more powerful than willpower, more powerful than financial education. Automating savings removes the most dangerous moment in the entire savings process, the moment of choice. Here's what happens without automation. Your paycheck lands. You see the full balance. You have a list of things you need to spend money on. You have a list of things you want to spend money on. You have an intention to save. And at the end of the month, after all the needs and wants have competed for the available dollars, whatever is left gets saved. Usually the answer is not much, because spending expands to fill available income with remarkable consistency, and save what's left almost always produces very little left. Here's what happens with automation. Your paycheck lands. Before you see the money, before you've had the chance to develop any sense of ownership over it, a predetermined amount moves automatically into your savings account. You see a smaller balance. You spend from the smaller balance. At the end of the month, you've saved the amount you decided to save in advance, not the amount that survived the competition of a month's spending decisions. The behavioral mechanism here is important. You're not exercising willpower. You're removing the decision entirely. The money moves before your spending brain knows it arrived. This is not a trick or a hack. It's a system designed to work with present bias rather than against it. Your present self never has to choose between spending and saving because the savings have already happened before the choice is available. Setting up automation is technically simple at most banks. Most employers allow split direct deposit, sending a portion of your paycheck directly to a savings account and the remainder to checking. Most savings accounts allow automatic recurring transfers from checking on a schedule you define. The right moment to set it up is payday, the day your paycheck arrives, not a random Tuesday when you're thinking about finances in the abstract. The amount to automate: start with whatever doesn't feel painful. This is not the time for heroic sacrifice. If $50 per paycheck is all you can move without it causing genuine hardship, automate $50. The point isn't the specific amount. The point is establishing the mechanism and the habit. once the automation is running and you've confirmed that $50 per paycheck isn't causing problems. Increase it by $25 or $50 the next month, then again the month after. Each increase is small. The cumulative effect is large. The account architecture. One underrated aspect of building savings momentum is account structure. The way you organize your money across accounts in a way that works with your psychology rather than against it. The basic architecture that works for most people: one checking account for daily spending, one high-yield savings account for the emergency fund, and one or more additional savings accounts for specific goals, separate accounts for separate purposes. The reason for separation is mental accounting, which we discussed in Chapter 2 as a cognitive bias. Here we're going to exploit it deliberately. When all your money lives in one account, everything competes with everything. The emergency fund competes with the vacation fund, competes with the I want to buy something impulse. The labels mean nothing when the money is indistinguishable. When the emergency fund is a separate account with a specific label and a specific balance and a specific purpose, it becomes psychologically harder to spend. The money has an identity. Spending it requires consciously overriding the label, which creates friction. The friction is mild, but mild friction is often enough to prevent the casual rating that undermines savings. Many online banks now allow you to create multiple savings buckets within a single account, giving each a custom name. Name them specifically: emergency fund, 4 months, car replacement, house down payment, freedom fund. Specificity matters psychologically. Savings is abstract. Emergency fund in 4 months is a goal with a purpose. You are far less likely to spend money from an account called emergency fund 4 months on something that isn't an emergency than you are to spend money from an account called savings. Dealing with setbacks without losing momentum. Every savings journey encounters setbacks, without exception. The car breaks, the medical bill arrives, the job situation changes. The expense that wasn't budgeted for materializes with confident inevitability. How you respond to setbacks determines whether you build long-term savings momentum or cycle endlessly through the same frustrating loop of progress and retreat. The most common response to a savings setback is a version of "what's the point?" The discouraging feeling that all the hard work has been undone and the goal is as far away as it was before you started. This response is psychologically understandable and financially catastrophic, because it leads to abandoning the behaviors that produced the progress in the first place. Here is the reframe that changes the relationship with setbacks. A setback is not evidence that saving doesn't work. It's evidence that the emergency fund is working exactly as intended. The whole point of the buffer is to absorb shocks without requiring debt. If you had a $3,000 car repair and you paid it from your emergency fund rather than putting it on a credit card, the emergency fund did its job. You don't feel good about the balance dropping, but you should feel good that you had the money because 6 months ago you didn't, and that repair would have gone on a card at 22% interest and cost you $600 more than the repair itself. The procedural response to a setback: replenish the emergency fund before resuming other savings goals. The fund is depleted, which means your financial fragility has temporarily increased. Restoring the buffer is the first priority. Once it's restored, you're back in the position you were before the setback. The progress didn't disappear, the timeline extended. There's a difference. The identity shift that changes everything. Here's something that sounds soft, but is, in practice, one of the most powerful forces in financial behavior. The shift from "I am trying to save money" to "I am someone who saves money." The first framing is behavioral. It describes an action you're attempting. It's subject to motivation, to willpower, to how you feel on any given day. When you're tired or stressed or tempted, the action is hard to sustain because it doesn't connect to anything deeper than "this is a good idea." The second framing is identity-based. It describes who you are, and people act consistent with their identities with remarkable consistency. Someone who sees themselves as a person who saves money makes spending decisions differently than someone who sees themselves as a person trying to save money. The identity filters decisions at a level that doesn't require active deliberation. It's built into how options are perceived and evaluated. How do you shift identity? Not through affirmations, not through willing yourself to believe something, through evidence. The identity shift happens when you accumulate enough instances of saving behavior that the behavior starts to feel like an expression of who you are rather than an imposition on who you are. This is part of why the early momentum matters so much. Every automated contribution, every milestone reached, every setback absorbed without going into debt, every time you make a financial decision that aligns with your savings goals, each of those is a data point in the identity file. Enough data points and the identity solidifies. And once the identity solidifies, saving stops being something you do with effort and starts being something you do because it's consistent with who you are. That transition is the moment the first 20,000 stops feeling impossible and starts feeling inevitable. It doesn't happen immediately. It doesn't happen at a specific balance, but it happens. And when it does, the path to the next 100,000 is easier than the path to the first 20,000 was. Not just because the math gets better, but because the person doing it has fundamentally changed. Chapter 7: The Lifestyle Inflation Trap and the Art of the Strategic No. You have been waiting, perhaps without realizing it, for permission to upgrade your life. The better apartment, the nicer car, the clothes that reflect where you're going rather than where you've been, the dinners at places where they don't ask if you want the combo. These desires are not shallow, they're human. They're the expression of wanting your external circumstances to match your internal sense of who you are and what you deserve. And the financial system, the marketing industry, your social circle, the ambient culture of aspiration is very, very ready to help you act on those desires the moment your income allows it. Lifestyle inflation is what happens when spending grows in proportion to or faster than income growth. It is the default setting of modern consumer life. It is the primary reason that people with good incomes often have the same net worth as people with mediocre ones, because the good income came with a proportional expansion of expenses that consumed all the growth. It is quiet, socially normalized, and genuinely enjoyable in the short term, which makes it one of the most insidious obstacles to building wealth. The mechanics of lifestyle. Inflation. Lifestyle inflation doesn't happen in dramatic purchases. It happens in the accumulation of small, individually reasonable upgrades that collectively consume income growth before it reaches savings. The sequence goes like this. You get a raise. You've been making do with a slightly worn couch. Surely you can now justify a nicer one. Your lease is up and the building down the street is a bit nicer, only $200 more per month. You can afford that now. A few of your friends are going to a new restaurant regularly that you used to skip because of the price. Now you go too. You've been driving the same car for 5 years and it's showing its age with the new salary. A reasonable car payment is manageable. None of these are reckless. Each one is individually defensible. Together, they consume a $12,000 annual raise in its entirety, and your savings rate has not moved. This is not hypothetical. It is the lived experience of the majority of people who receive income increases throughout their careers. Salary doubles over 10 years. Net worth doesn't. The income went somewhere. It went to lifestyle, to the gradual, enjoyable, socially reinforced, individually reasonable expansion of spending that follows income like a shadow. The gap is where the wealth lives. Here's the most important financial concept in this chapter, possibly in this entire video. Your wealth is not built by how much you earn. It's built by the gap between what you earn and what you spend. That's it. The gap is everything. Two people with identical incomes and different lifestyle inflation trajectories will have dramatically different net worths over time. Two people with very different incomes but similar gaps, similar percentages saved, will be closer to each other financially than their income difference suggests. This means that protecting the gap is a primary financial responsibility, not just saving diligently, but actively resisting the forces that work to close the gap every time income grows. Every incremental income increase is a decision point. Does this increase the gap, or does it get absorbed by lifestyle expansion? The answer to that question, made repeatedly over years and decades, determines the trajectory of your financial life more powerfully than almost any other single factor. The strategic no, choosing which upgrades to make. The alternative to lifestyle inflation is not asceticism. It is not never upgrading anything, never spending on experiences, never allowing your standard of living to improve as your income improves. That's a miserable existence, and it's not what we're Recommending. The alternative is intentionality, consciously deciding which upgrades are worth the ongoing cost and which ones aren't, based on how much lasting happiness they actually produce, rather than how much they're expected to produce in the moment. The hedonic adaptation research from Chapter 2 is directly relevant here. Most lifestyle upgrades produce temporary pleasure that adapts away within weeks to months. The nicer apartment that seemed like a meaningful quality of life improvement in month 1 is just where you live by month 6. The car that was exciting is just your commute by the time the new car smell has faded. Knowing this, you can evaluate lifestyle upgrades differently. Not, will this feel good, but will this feel good enough for long enough to justify its ongoing cost compared to what else I could do with that money? Some upgrades will pass that test. A move closer to work that saves you an hour of commuting per day is genuinely worth significant ongoing cost because that time has real and durable quality of life value. Better health insurance that removes anxiety about medical expenses has genuine ongoing value. Things that improve the quality of your daily lived experience in ways that don't fully adapt away, these are worth upgrading for. Many other upgrades will fail the test on honest examination. The larger apartment where the extra room becomes storage, the car upgrade that provides excitement for 3 weeks and then is just a car. The clothing level that requires constant updating to maintain, these are the upgrades to say the strategic no to, not because you can never have them, but because the math of what their ongoing cost would compound to over a decade makes the choice clearer. Saying no to social pressure. Here's where lifestyle inflation gets harder to resist: other people, not in a peer pressure, everyone's doing it way exactly, but in the more subtle and pervasive way that social comparison shapes what feels normal, expected, and adequate. The research on social comparison and financial behavior is unambiguous. People's financial decisions are heavily influenced by the spending of their peers. What your friends, colleagues, and social circles spend on housing, cars, restaurants, vacations, and everything else shapes your sense of what's normal, and normal becomes the baseline against which your own spending feels like sacrifice or adequacy. This is why financial advice that says, "just don't care what other people think," is both correct and useless. Of course, you shouldn't make financial decisions to impress people who don't care about your financial health. You already know that. The problem is that the influence of social comparison doesn't operate through conscious, deliberate choice. It operates through the ambient recalibration of what feels normal, which affects your spending preferences before the deliberate decision-making even begins. The practical response. Be deliberate about your reference group, the people you spend the most time with, whose lives and spending you observe most closely have an outsized influence on your financial behavior. This doesn't mean you should curate your friendships purely for financial optimization. That's both sad and impractical. But it does mean being aware of the influence and potentially seeking out social connections with people who have the financial values you're trying to build, because their normal will reinforce your goals rather than work against them. Personal finance communities, online forums, local groups, accountability partnerships can provide exactly this kind of alternative reference group. Being around people for whom saving and investing is exciting and normal, rather than weird and restrictive, changes what feels normal to you. This is a feature, not a bug. Chapter 8. The Other Side. What happens after 20,000? You've done the work, you've navigated the behavioral obstacles, worked on the income, resisted the extraction economy, followed the sequence, built momentum, and protected the gap. The balance reads $20,000. Maybe it took 2 years, maybe it took 5. The timeline doesn't matter. You're here. What happens now? This chapter is about the other side, not because we've fully arrived at financial security, but because understanding what lies ahead changes the relationship with the early struggle. The first 20,000 is hard in ways we've spent this entire video documenting. What comes after is different, and understanding how it's different is genuinely motivating in a way that abstract encouragement isn't. The math finally works in your favor. Remember the compound interest math from Chapter 1? The $38 in interest after 6 months of saving, which was theoretically exciting and practically invisible? Here's what happens to that math at $20,000. $20,000 in a high-yield savings account at 4.5% earns $900 in interest in the first year. Not $38, $900. That's $75 per month that arrives without any additional contribution from you. It's not a fortune, but it's real, it's visible, and it compounds from there. More importantly, if that $20,000 is directed toward investment, a diversified index fund portfolio in a tax-advantaged retirement account, for example, the long-run expected return shifts the math even more dramatically. At 7% average annual return, $20,000 becomes $40,000 in roughly 10 years without any additional contributions. Add continued contributions, and the growth accelerates further. This is the inflection point that makes the early struggle worth it. Not just in the abstract future you will thank you way that finance teachers say, but in the concrete, mathematical, visible way that starts to feel real once the balance is large enough to produce meaningful returns. The account is now working for you in a way that it simply couldn't when it contained nothing. The fragility transforms into resilience. One of the most significant things that changes at $20,000 is your relationship to financial risk. Below the buffer threshold, every unexpected expense is a crisis. Above it, the same expense is an inconvenience. A $2,000 car repair at zero savings is a 22% credit card debt event, possibly a cascading bill payment crisis, definitely a source of significant stress and sleep disruption. The same $2,000 repair with $20,000 in savings is an afternoon of mild annoyance and a 2-month replenishment plan. The expense is identical. The financial life around it is completely different. This transformation, from fragility to resilience, has effects that extend beyond the obvious. With financial resilience comes the ability to take calculated risks you couldn't take before. The ability to say no to a job that's paying you badly because you have enough runway to find a better one. The ability to invest in professional development without worrying that the expense will tip your budget. The ability to negotiate better terms on major purchases because you can walk away. The ability to deal with health issues proactively rather than delaying care because of cost. Financial resilience isn't just a financial condition, it's a life condition. The psychological weight lifts. This one is harder to quantify but important enough to name explicitly. The psychological experience of having $20,000 in savings is fundamentally different from the psychological experience of having none. The research on financial stress and mental health is clear. Financial insecurity is one of the most significant contributors to chronic stress, anxiety, depression, and relationship strain in modern life. It affects sleep. It affects physical health. It affects cognitive function. Recall the scarcity research from Chapter 2, where financial stress demonstrably impaired cognitive performance. The burden of financial fragility is not just financial, it's carried in the body and the mind in ways that affect everything. The relief that comes from building genuine financial security, not perfect security, not permanent security, but a meaningful buffer against the ordinary turbulence of life, is real and substantial. People who cross the threshold consistently report that the relief isn't just about the specific amount. It's about the shift in the fundamental relationship with uncertainty, from dreading the next thing that goes wrong to feeling able to handle it. From financial life as a source of chronic anxiety to financial life as a manageable, predictable, increasingly positive trajectory thing, that shift is worth working for, not just because of what the money enables in a practical sense, but because of who you become in the process of building it and what it feels like to live on the other side of financial fragility. The path gets clearer. Here's another thing that changes at $20,000: clarity. The first $20,000 is largely about survival. Building the buffer, eliminating the expensive debt, establishing the habits and systems. The questions are urgent and the margin for error is small. Beyond $20,000, the questions shift. Now you're thinking about optimization rather than survival. Do you accelerate mortgage payoff or invest? Do you maximize a Roth IRA or a traditional 401k? Do you keep the full emergency fund in high-yield savings or shift some of it to short-term bonds? What's the right balance between enjoying money now and building for the future? How aggressively should you be investing, and in what? These are better problems to have, not easy problems. Personal finance doesn't stop being complicated at $20,000. But the nature of the complexity changes from how do I survive to how do I optimize? That's a meaningful and qualitatively different upgrade in the problem you're working on. Avoiding the trap of arrival. One thing worth naming before we close this chapter: the $20,000 milestone, like any milestone, carries the risk of arrival fallacy, the sense that you've done the thing, you can relax, the work is finished. It isn't. $20,000 is a foundation, not a destination. It's the point at which the building of financial security becomes possible, not the point at which it's complete. The trap at this stage is a version of the lifestyle inflation trap from Chapter 7, the feeling that because you've built this much, you've now earned a reward that justifies pulling back the savings rate or upgrading your lifestyle to the full extent your income allows. This feeling is understandable. It's also the precise moment when the momentum you've built can either compound into genuine long-term wealth or get absorbed by the lifestyle expansion that was waiting patiently for your discipline to waver. The move is to celebrate genuinely. The milestone is real and worth acknowledging, and then to set the next milestone immediately. The next clear goal, the next number, 50,000, a 6-month emergency fund, maxing out the Roth IRA, whatever the right next step is for your specific situation. Having the target is what keeps the momentum alive. The savings identity you've built doesn't maintain itself without continued action. Keep acting. Chapter 9: The Comparison Trap. How social media is quietly bankrupting your motivation. Let's talk about the phone in your pocket. Specifically, let's talk about what happens to your financial psychology every time you open it and scroll through the curated, filtered, selectively presented highlight reel of other people's financial lives, because there is a direct, documented, measurable connection between social media consumption and financial behavior, and it is not a positive one. Not because social media is evil, not because the people posting are lying exactly, but because the specific way that social media presents human life creates a distorted picture of financial reality that systematically undermines your motivation, your satisfaction, and your ability to accurately assess your own progress. This chapter is about the comparison trap, what it is, how it works, why it's so much more powerful than you think, and what you can actually do about it in a world where complete digital abstinence is neither realistic nor necessary. The basic mechanism: why comparison feels involuntary. Human beings are social animals with a deeply embedded instinct for social comparison. This isn't a weakness or a character flaw. It's a cognitive tool that served important functions in ancestral environments. Knowing where you stood relative to others in your group and status and resources and capability provided genuinely useful information for decision-making, alliance building, and survival. The brain that paid attention to social comparison had real advantages over the brain that didn't. The problem is that this comparison instinct was calibrated for a specific kind of social environment. Small groups of people you actually knew, in real proximity, living genuinely comparable lives. In that environment, social comparison produced mostly accurate signals about your relative standing and what adjustments you might need to make. Social media has detonated that calibration completely. Your comparison pool is no longer the 50 to 200 people in your immediate social world. It is potentially millions of people globally who have been algorithmically selected for their ability to generate engagement, which, on platforms built around visual aspiration, means people living visually impressive lives or presenting themselves as if they are. The comparison pool has expanded by orders of magnitude and simultaneously become radically unrepresentative of actual human financial experience. You are comparing your ordinary Tuesday to someone else's vacation. You are comparing your apartment to someone else's highlight renovation. You are comparing your checking account balance, in which you know intimately, including every struggle and shortfall, to someone else's financial presentation, which shows only what they've chosen to show, filtered through whatever narrative they've decided to project. This is not a fair comparison. It was never designed to be, and yet the comparison instinct doesn't make those adjustments automatically. It sees the input and generates the emotional response: inadequacy, frustration, the sense that you're behind, before your rational mind has a chance to contextualize what you're actually looking at. The specific ways social media damages financial behavior. The comparison trap isn't just an emotional nuisance. It produces specific, measurable behavioral effects that directly undermine savings. The first is what researchers call relative deprivation, the feeling of lacking something not in absolute terms but relative to a reference group. Relative deprivation is a stronger driver of financial dissatisfaction than absolute financial position. In other words, how you feel about your financial situation depends less on what you actually have and more on what you perceive others around you to have. A person making $60,000 surrounded by people making $50,000 feels financially better than a person making $70,000 surrounded by people making $90,000, even though the second person has objectively more money. Social comparison shapes financial perception more powerfully than actual financial reality. On social media, the reference group is systematically skewed upward. The content that gets amplified is aspirational content, luxury travel, home renovations, new cars, restaurant experiences, fashion hauls, business success stories. This isn't because most people's lives look like this, it's because this content generates engagement, and the algorithm rewards engagement. The result is a reference group that looks dramatically more affluent than the actual population, which produces chronic relative deprivation in average viewers. Chronic relative deprivation produces predictable behaviors, compensatory spending to close the perceived gap, reduced saving satisfaction because progress never feels adequate relative to the reference group, and financial decision-making oriented toward appearing successful rather than building genuine wealth. These are not small effects. Research has found meaningful correlations between social media usage intensity and measures of financial stress, debt levels, and impulse purchasing. The second behavioral effect is what we might call aspirational contagion, the transmission of lifestyle desires through social observation. When you watch someone you follow renovate their kitchen, you didn't previously want a renovated kitchen, now you do. When you see a friend's new car, you didn't previously feel dissatisfied with yours, now you do, a little. Each piece of aspirational content plants a small seed of desire that, aggregated across hundreds of pieces of content per day, produces a constant low-level hum of wanting for things you didn't want before the content told you to want them. This is not weakness. It's the normal functioning of social learning in an abnormal environment. Social learning is supposed to help you identify what's valuable by observing what others pursue. In a curated content environment where what others pursue is systematically skewed toward luxury and aspiration, social learning misfires. It generates desire for things that don't represent the actual value system of most people, let alone your own. The third effect is motivational. Social media can make this savings journey feel futile by making visible a version of financial success that seems inaccessibly distant from where you are. When financial success is presented as a Maldives vacation, a paid-off Tesla, and a side hustle generating passive income, the actual financial success of having 18 months of expenses saved and no consumer debt feels invisible and inadequate by comparison. The real wins don't look like content. The real wins are boring. And in a world where you're constantly comparing your boring real wins to other people's exciting content wins, boring real wins feel like failure even when they're genuinely significant progress. The wealth illusion, what you're actually looking at. Here's a piece of context that changes the social media financial comparison picture significantly. A meaningful portion of the financial aspiration you're consuming on social media is either illusory, debt-financed, or both. The car in the driveway might have a $700 monthly payment. The renovated kitchen might have been charged to a home equity line of credit that's going to take a decade to pay off. The luxury vacation might have been funded by points and credit card rewards, or it might have simply been charged to a card and not thought about very carefully. The successful entrepreneur content might be generating significant gross revenue while the actual business is operating at a loss or barely breaking even. You are not seeing the debt. You are not seeing the credit card statements. You are not seeing the anxiety about the car payment, or the argument about the renovation budget, or the quietly terrifying reality of a bank account that looks fine on the surface and isn't. You are seeing the output of a curation process designed to present a specific image, and that image is, almost by definition, not the complete financial picture. There is a widely cited statistic that the majority of Americans couldn't cover a $400 emergency expense from savings without borrowing or selling something. That statistic has been updated and debated, but its general thrust remains accurate. Financial fragility is extremely common across all income levels, including income levels that look affluent on the outside. The person posting the beautiful home content is quite often the person who is privately under significant financial strain that the content never reveals. This doesn't mean everyone posting aspirational content is secretly broke. Some of it is genuine. Some of those cars are owned outright. Some of those renovations were saved for carefully. But you cannot tell the difference from the content, and assuming the financial solidity of what you're seeing because the presentation is polished is a form of assumption that costs you in the relative deprivation it produces and the financial decisions it influences. The practical response: auditing your inputs. The comparison trap can't be eliminated by knowing about it. The emotional response to social comparison doesn't disappear because you understand its cognitive mechanism. What can change is the inputs, what you're actually comparing yourself to, and the intentional construction of a healthier reference environment. Start with an audit of your current consumption. Spend a week paying attention to how different types of content make you feel about your financial situation. Content that leaves you feeling inadequate, behind, or urgently wanting things you didn't want before you saw the post. That content is costing you something, not just the emotional toll, but the behavioral influence it's having on your spending impulses and your saving satisfaction. Flag it consciously, then make deliberate changes to the inputs. Unfollow or mute accounts whose primary function in your feed is making you feel financially inadequate or generating aspirational desire you didn't have before following them. This includes accounts you genuinely like as people. The mute function exists precisely so you can reduce exposure without the social cost of unfollowing. You are not required to consume content that makes your financial journey harder, regardless of who produces it. Replace that content intentionally, not just by default, with content that reinforces the financial identity you're building. Personal finance communities on Reddit, YouTube channels focused on actual financial education rather than aspiration performance, accounts that document realistic savings journeys, including the struggles. These exist in abundance. The algorithm will show you more of whatever you engage with, which means deliberately engaging with the content that supports your goals will gradually recalibrate your feed toward a healthier reference environment. This is not about becoming a financial monk who only consumes spreadsheets and index fund discussions. It's about deliberately shaping the ambient input environment so that your comparison baseline is closer to reality and closer to the values that are actually going to serve your financial life, rather than being set entirely by the aspirational content machine. The gratitude reframe without the cringe. Here is a suggestion that risks sounding like a motivational poster, but has genuine empirical support. Deliberately noticing and acknowledging your own financial progress in concrete terms on a regular basis reduces the relative deprivation effect of social comparison. This isn't about toxic positivity or pretending your situation is better than it is. It's about counteracting the systematic skew of social media comparison with accurate information about your own trajectory. Your feed is showing you everyone else's highlights. No one is showing you your highlights. You have to do that yourself. Practically, this means tracking your net worth, the total of your assets minus your debts, and reviewing it monthly, not obsessively, not anxiously, but as a regular check-in with your own progress. A net worth that is increasing, even slowly, is evidence of positive financial trajectory. Evidence of positive trajectory is the antidote to the feeling, fed by social comparison, that nothing is working. When you feel the comparison sting of seeing someone's financial highlight, the constructive response is not to suppress the feeling or tell yourself it doesn't matter. It's to redirect attention to your own actual data. What is your savings balance today compared to 6 months ago? What debt have you eliminated this year? What financial decisions have you made recently that align with your goals? Your financial highlight reel exists. You just have to be the one to look at it deliberately, because no algorithm is going to do it for you. The community alternative. There's one more practical response to the comparison trap that deserves specific mention: replacing aspirational comparison with community accountability. Accountability partnerships. Two people who share financial goals and check in regularly about progress, challenges, and next steps have meaningful empirical support in behavioral finance research. The social element that makes comparison destructive when it's competitive and upward-facing becomes constructive when it's collaborative and bidirectional. An accountability partner isn't someone you're comparing yourself to. They're someone who is in the same struggle, at a comparable stage, working toward comparable goals. The social comparison instinct gets channeled toward collaborative motivation rather than competitive inadequacy. Online personal finance communities, forums, Discord servers, Reddit communities can provide a version of this at scale. The culture of communities like r/personal finance or r/financial independence is oriented around actual financial behavior, sharing real numbers, asking real questions, celebrating real milestones, and treating financial struggle as a normal and discussable part of the journey rather than something to be hidden behind a curated presentation. The reference group in these communities is dramatically more realistic than the reference group your Instagram feed provides. Spending time there recalibrates your sense of normal in genuinely useful directions. The point is this: the comparison instinct isn't going away. It's too deeply embedded, too automatic, too fundamental to how human social cognition works. The goal isn't to eliminate it, it's to feed it better inputs that motivate rather than demoralize, that reflect reality rather than curation, and that reinforce the identity and the trajectory you're actually building rather than the aspirational performance of people you've never met and whose actual financial lives you know nothing about. Your progress is real. Your trajectory matters. Your $20,000, however close or far you are from it, is genuinely significant in a way that no amount of social media scrolling will ever reflect back to you accurately. The accounting of your progress is your job, done with your own data, in your own time, without reference to anyone else's highlight reel. Do that accounting, trust your own numbers, and maybe, just maybe, put the phone down for a little while. Chapter 10: The Emotional Architecture of Money. Shame, scarcity, and the stories we tell ourselves. We have spent most of this video talking about money as a mathematical and behavioral problem, and it is those things, but it is also, and this part gets left out of most financial content because it's uncomfortable and doesn't lend itself to bullet points, an emotional problem, a psychological one, sometimes a deeply personal one that has roots in childhood, in family dynamics, in cultural identity, in experiences of loss or scarcity that happened long before you were old enough to open a bank account. This final chapter before the conclusion is about the emotional architecture of money, the feelings, the stories, the inherited beliefs, and the shame that sit underneath the surface of financial behavior and often determine it more powerfully than any mathematical understanding or behavioral system. Because you can know everything in this video intellectually and still find yourself unable to act on it if the emotional layer isn't addressed, and the emotional layer deserves to be named. The money story you inherited. Every person who grew up in a household with a financial life, which is every person, absorbed a set of beliefs about money from that environment. Not always explicitly taught, often just absorbed, through observation, through the emotional tone of conversations about money, through what was said and what was carefully not said, through the experience of abundance or scarcity or anxiety or casualness around financial matters. These absorbed beliefs form what some therapists and financial psychologists call your money story, the narrative you carry about what money means, who deserves it, whether it's safe to have it, whether people like you can accumulate it, what having it or not having it says about your worth as a person. Money stories vary enormously. Some people grow up in households where money is discussed openly, where saving is modeled and celebrated, where financial competence is treated as a learnable skill and a source of pride. These people tend to have a relatively healthy baseline relationship with financial behavior, not because their life is easier necessarily, but because the emotional framework they inherited supports rather than undermines financial action. Other people grow up in households where money is a source of chronic stress, shame, conflict, or silence, where financial struggle is either never discussed or discussed in ways that associate it with failure, judgment, and inadequacy, where saving feels foreign because it was never modeled, where spending is used as a source of comfort or control or identity in an environment where control and comfort were otherwise scarce, where wealth is associated with people who are different, luckier, better connected, more deserving in some vague way, rather than something achievable through behavior and time. These money stories are not deterministic. They don't decide your financial future, but they do operate as a background filter through which every financial decision passes, and if the filter is set to people like me don't build savings, or money is something that causes pain and conflict, or wanting more than enough is greedy, then the filter is actively working against the behaviors that produce financial progress. Identifying your money story, actually sitting with it, examining where it came from, asking whether it's accurate or just inherited, is more important than most financial content acknowledges. Not because therapy replaces budgeting, but because unexamined beliefs produce behaviors you can't explain and can't change until you understand where they're coming from. The specific weight of scarcity. Shame. There is a particular emotional experience that people who have lived with genuine financial scarcity often carry that deserves its own name: scarcity shame. The feeling that not having enough money is not just an inconvenient circumstance, but an indictment of your intelligence, your discipline, your worth as a person, your right to take up space in a society that valorizes financial success. Scarcity shame is pervasive and largely invisible because the cultural messaging around money in most Western societies is built on a foundation of meritocracy, the belief that financial outcomes reflect personal merit, that people have what they deserve and deserve what they have. In a society that genuinely believes this, financial struggle carries a moral charge that financial ease doesn't. Struggling means you've failed at something you were supposed to succeed at. It means something is wrong with you. This is both empirically wrong and psychologically devastating. The factors that most powerfully predict financial outcomes, the family you're born into, the neighborhood you grow up in, the quality of the schools you attend, the social networks you have access to, the health of your body and mind, the economic conditions of the specific moment you enter the labor market, are mostly outside individual control. The meritocratic story is a significant oversimplification that serves certain political and social functions while causing genuine psychological harm to the people it blames for outcomes they didn't fully determine. Scarcity shame is worth naming not to eliminate personal responsibility, your behavior matters, and this entire video has been premised on that, but to distinguish between the productive discomfort of I want to make different choices and the unproductive, paralyzing shame of I am a deficient person because my bank account is small. The first feeling is a motivation, the second is a wound. They require different responses. If you carry scarcity shame, and many people reading this do, even if they haven't named it that, the work of addressing it is both personal and practical. Personal in the sense that it may involve therapy, journaling, honest conversations with trusted people, and the slow process of separating your worth as a person from the number in your bank account. Practical in the sense that taking small, consistent financial actions that produce visible progress is one of the most effective antidotes to shame because it builds evidence, real, tangible, undeniable evidence, that the story of financial incapacity is not permanently true. Action is the antidote to shame, in money as in most things. Not grand action, not dramatic transformation, small, consistent, accumulating action that builds a different story through the weight of evidence rather than through the force of positive thinking. The comfort spending cycle. Here's where the emotional architecture of money connects most directly to the practical challenge of building savings. The relationship between emotional states and spending behavior. For many people, spending serves emotional functions that have nothing to do with the thing being purchased. Spending is comfort after a hard day. Spending is reward for enduring something difficult. Spending is control when other things feel out of control. Spending is identity. The clothes, the car, the apartment that say something about who you are or who you're trying to become. Spending is connection, the dinners out, the gifts, the experiences shared with people you love. Spending is sometimes the only available pleasure in a life that is otherwise marked by scarcity, stress, and constraint. These are not trivial functions, they're real needs being met in the available way. The problem is not that you're weak or undisciplined for having them. The problem is that spending as an emotional management strategy is expensive, ineffective at actually addressing the underlying need, and directly in conflict with savings goals. Expensive because money spent on emotional regulation is money that isn't being saved. Ineffective because the emotional relief from a purchase is temporary. Recall hedonic adaptation, which means the underlying need returns, which means the next purchase follows, which means the spending pattern becomes a cycle rather than a solution, and conflicting with savings because the cycle is self-reinforcing in ways that systematically drain the account. The practical response is not to eliminate the emotional need, which is both impossible and unnecessary. It's to identify the emotional function the spending is serving and then find alternative ways to serve that function that don't carry the same financial cost. This is not go for a walk instead of shopping in the dismissive, minimizing way that advice usually gets delivered. It's a genuine inquiry into what the spending is actually for, what feeling it's producing or avoiding, and a deliberate search for other sources of that feeling. Sometimes the answer is genuinely simple. The dinner out is about connection, and the connection can be served by a dinner in with the same people. The retail therapy is about treating yourself, and a genuinely free or inexpensive alternative provides the same psychological function. Sometimes the answer is more complex. The spending is managing anxiety or depression or loneliness in ways that have no simple, cheap substitute. And the real work is addressing the anxiety or depression or loneliness directly, which might mean professional support or medication or significant life changes, and which is almost certainly more important than any budget optimization. The financial symptoms of emotional struggles are real, but treating only the financial symptoms without addressing the emotional causes is like turning off the smoke alarm without investigating what's on fire. The alarm will keep going off. Address the fire. Giving yourself permission to not be perfect. Here's the thing about financial behavior that nobody says loudly enough. It doesn't have to be perfect to work. You don't need a flawless month every month. You don't need to nail every spending decision. You don't need to maintain the motivation of the first week for the entire decade. You need to be good enough, often enough, with systems robust enough to survive the months when you're not. The perfectionism trap in personal finance is real and costly. People who have adopted an all-or-nothing framework, either I'm doing everything right or I've failed and I might as well stop, blow up their financial progress with their own internal standards. They have a bad month, they feel the shame of having had a bad month, and instead of simply returning to the system, they abandon it. The system wasn't the problem. The framework that required perfection was good enough, sustained with reasonable systems, produces dramatically better outcomes than perfect, intermittent, with nothing but willpower. A person who saves $200 a month automatically for 5 years while occasionally spending impulsively has more money than a person who saves $500 a month heroically for 3 months and then gives up because they had a bad April. Permission to be imperfect is not permission to be reckless. It's permission to be human, to have months that don't go the way you planned, to make purchases you later regret, to miss a savings contribution once, and not make it mean something catastrophic about your character or your future. The system continues. The automation keeps running. The progress resumes. That's the whole design. The moment, everything changes. There is a moment, hard to predict in advance, impossible to manufacture artificially, but reliably reported by people who've built through it. When the relationship with money fundamentally shifts, it's not at a specific dollar amount. It's not triggered by a specific event. It's more like a gradual accumulation of evidence reaching a tipping point, at which the belief, I can do this, transitions from a hope to a fact. The moment is characterized by a few things. The savings behavior stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like identity. The monthly contribution happens automatically, and you barely notice it. A financial setback happens, and you handle it without crisis or despair. You look at the balance, and the number feels real, rather than aspirational. Someone else talks about financial struggle in the way you used to talk about it, and you notice, gently, without superiority, that you're in a different place now. That moment is available to you. It is not reserved for people with specific advantages or specific incomes or specific personalities. It is the product of consistent action, sustained over time, with systems that survive the months when motivation fails. It is built from the understanding, the real, internalized understanding, not just the intellectual acknowledgement. that the difficulty of the early stages is structural, not personal, and that the structure changes as the balance grows. The first $20,000 is the hardest because it's the beginning, because the math hasn't started working in your favor yet, because the brain is fighting the behavior, because the system is extracting from whatever you manage to accumulate, because the reference environment is showing you everyone else's financial highlights while hiding your own genuine progress. But it is not impossible. It has been done by people with your income, your circumstances, your cognitive wiring, your emotional history with money. It is being done right now by people who started exactly where you are, with exactly the obstacles you have, who simply kept going when the early stages felt like nothing was working. The money will build, the math will shift, the fragility will become resilience, the struggle will become competence, the competence will become identity. Keep going. Conclusion. We started this video with a simple, universal observation. The first $20,000 feels impossibly hard in a way that seems disproportionate to the amount. We've spent a lot of time explaining why that's true, and it's worth summarizing the layers one final time, because the explanation is also the map. The math is against you at the beginning. Compound interest is invisible on small balances. The returns are backloaded. Financial fragility is expensive. Fixed costs consume a disproportionate share of lower incomes. None of that is your fault, and none of it is permanent. Your brain is not built for this. Present bias, loss aversion, mental accounting, scarcity mindset, hedonic adaptation, the cognitive architecture of the human mind is misaligned with the specific demands of long-term saving in ways that aren't moral failures, but design challenges. Design challenges can be addressed with systems, automation, and structure rather than raw willpower. The system is extracting from you banking fees, insurance pricing, rent-to-own schemes, payday lending, subscription creep, car culture, sophisticated marketing. The modern financial environment contains numerous mechanisms specifically calibrated to move money from people with less of it to people and institutions with more of it. Naming them is the first step to navigating around them. For some people, the income is genuinely insufficient. The answer in that case is not harder budgeting, but income growth. Negotiation, job switching, skill development, additional income streams, and the timeline is longer, but the path is real. The sequence matters. Buffer first, then debt, then savings. Not simultaneously, not in reverse, but in the order that each level of stability creates the conditions for the next. Momentum is real and buildable. Intermediate milestones, automation, the right account architecture, identity construction, setback protocols. These are the tools of momentum, and momentum is what turns the impossible feeling into the inevitable reality. Lifestyle inflation is the default, and resisting it is the work. The gap between income and spending is where wealth lives. Protecting the gap intentionally, strategically, without becoming miserable, is the ongoing practice of financial health. And on the other side of $20,000, the math changes, the fragility transforms into resilience, the psychological weight lifts, and the path forward becomes clearer, more enjoyable, and more powerful than anything on this side of it suggests. The first 20,000 is hard because it's meant to be. It's the proving ground. It's where you build the habits, develop the identity, install the systems, and acquire the understanding that makes everything after it possible. It doesn't feel like a foundation while you're laying it. It feels like struggle. But that's what foundations feel like from the inside. Do the work, get above the threshold, build the buffer, eliminate the expensive debt, automate the savings, protect the gap, reach the milestone, because the first $20,000 doesn't just change your bank account, it changes what you believe is possible, and that belief, that specific evidence-based, hard-won belief, is worth more than the $20,000 itself.